This is my version of The Boarded Window by Ambrose Bierce, published in 1891. These mountains guard their secrets well. We may find some fading remnant, a arrowhead lost long ago, the battered boiler of a moonshine still, the initials of two long dead lovers carved into the side of an oak tree. But the instant these marks are made, the mountains begin to erase them. In time, these traces will vanish just as completely as the people who left them. In the most rugged section of these mountains lies the ruins of an old cabin. It is shrouded by dense forest, to the point that even the most vigilant hunter passing nearby might miss the cabin entirely. There is evidence of a sort of a long abandoned attempt to clear land for crops in front. Large decaying stumps are visible here and there, but the underbrush has long since reclaimed most of that ground. The cabin itself is a small one-room affair with a stone chimney on one side and a covered porch with an entry door across the front. The cedar shingles on the roof caved in long ago, surrendering to soaking rains and the frost of winter. The rear of the cabin is dominated by a large wooden frame that was once the cabin's only window. But that space has since been carefully covered over with heavy boards and is today the most well-preserved section of the entire cabin. Even now, not even the faintest glimmer of sunlight can pass through the boarded window. Was this cabin haunted? Perhaps. In the years before his death, the man who built this cabin was most certainly a haunted man. He looked 70, but could not have been more than 50 years old. His hair, his long, full beard were both solid white. His eyes were gray and lifeless and seemed to have sunken into his face. He was tall and thin and stood with the stooped shoulders of a man who had carried a heavy burden for a long, long time. His name was Murlock. He and his wife, Sarah, were among the early settlers in this area, and they arrived here young, strong, and full of hope. They did not build their cabin near the trading post or even near other settlers. Instead, they journeyed 2 days more till Murlock selected this patch of rugged forest ground where his only neighbors could be the creatures of the forest or a passing Cherokee. Don't like much people around, Murlock said. Makes me feel proud. But for all his love of quiet and solitude, Murlock was deeply devoted to his young bride. Sarah was the one who shared the dangers and hardships of their life with a willing spirit and a light heart. She was his partner in every way. As Murlock set about building the cabin and clearing the land, Sarah worked by his side. She was no match for his physical strength, but Murlock knew that Sarah was his spirit and soul. No matter how discouraged or exhausted he became, he knew that in the evening there would come a time when the two of them would just sit quietly together. He would rest his head on her chest. She would stroke his hair, and all would come right once more. One day Murlock came home from a long hunting trip to find his wife lying on the cabin floor, delirious with fever. There was no doctor within miles, of course, or even a neighbor who might help. So Murlock set about nursing her back to health. But by the end of the third day, Sarah fell into unconsciousness and exhaled a long, rasping breath that Murlock felt certain was her last. He fetched the small mirror from her table and held it to her nostrils. No breath. He placed 2 fingers on the inside of her wrist. No pulse. And Murlock sat beside Sarah on the edge of their bed for a long time, with his face buried in his 2 big hands. When he was certain that she was dead, Murlock knew that the responsibility for preparing the body for burial must fall to him. He had vague recollections of his mother and aunts preparing townspeople for burial. They kept a large laying out board to hold the cooling body, but Murlock supposed that his kitchen table could serve that same purpose. There were rituals to perform. He needed to pass a lighted candle the full length of the body 3 times. Or was it 5? And there was something about salt in a bowl. Murlock knew his efforts were but a crude imitation of the original task. But other duties came to him more readily, and Murlock performed those mechanically and without emotion. He washed and dressed the body. He bound her wrists and ankles with ribbon. He arranged her long, beautiful hair on each side of her face. Sometimes he would get distracted and repeat the same task over and over. In other cases, a task as simple as tying a bow seemed to require supernatural power. Murlock was astonished at these failures, much as a drunken man is startled by his sudden inability to walk. There were other rituals to perform, ones he needed to perform before it was too late. But his attempts to summon them brought only clouds and smoke. To clear his mind, Murlock threw open the rear window and breathed deeply of the wild lilacs that Sarah had loved. It was growing dark. He would need to light the lantern soon. Murlock was surprised and more than a little ashamed that he did not weep. For surely it was unkind not to weep for the dead. Tomorrow I will build the coffin and dig the grave. And then I will miss her when she is no longer before my eyes. But for now, she's dead, of course, but everything will be all right. All will come right once more. For as Murlock's hands worked on, his consciousness maintained the belief that everything would be all right, that he would have Sarah back just as before and everything explained. Perhaps this was the dream, and tomorrow morning they would awaken together and they might have a laugh at the silliness of it all. For you see, Murlock had no experience with grief. His heart could not contain it all. His imagination could not rightly conceive of its power. For grief is a musician with unlimited range. It plays a funeral dirge on each individual, evoking sharp, shrill shrieks from some, low, rhythmic moans from others. To one, grief comes like a slice of a razor, sharp and stinging, rousing all the senses to a fever pitch. To another, grief falls like the blow of a blacksmith's hammer, leaving everything in its path crushed and gone. This last is how it was with Murlock. For no sooner did he finish his work than he sank into a chair beside the table where the body lay. He placed his arms on the table's edge and dropped his face onto them, unutterably weary. And at that moment, through the open window, came a long, wailing sound, like the cry of a lost child deep in the darkened woods. But the man did not move. Again, and nearer than before, that unearthly cry fell upon him. Perhaps it was a wild beast. Perhaps it was a dream. For Murlock was asleep. Some hours later, this unfaithful watcher awoke and lifted his head from his arms. He listened intently, but for what? There in the black darkness by the side of the dead, he recalled everything that had happened, and without emotion. He strained his eyes to see anything. His senses were all alert. His breathing had stopped. Even his blood seemed to have ceased flowing to help create the silence. Who, what had awakened him? And where was it? Suddenly something shook the table beneath his arms, and at the same moment he heard, or imagined he heard, a light, soft footstep. Then another. The sound of bare feet on the cabin floor. Had Sarah come back to him? How he longed to call out her name or simply reach out his arm and learn if she was still there. But he was terrified beyond the ability to cry out or to move. And so he waited. For what felt like a century, he waited. And then it happened. Some heavy body slammed the table into his chest, nearly knocking him down. And at the same instant, something fell to the floor with such a violent thump that it shook the entire cabin. A scuffling ensued and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. At last, Murlock rose to his feet. He flung his arms across the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which terror is overcome by madness, and that madness screams for action. With no motive beyond the impulse of a madman, Murlock sprang to the wall, groping for his loaded rifle, and when he found it, he fired at once without aiming. And by the flash that lit the entire room for one vivid instant, he saw an enormous mountain lion dragging the dead woman toward the open window, its teeth fixed in her throat. And then darkness came, blacker than before, and silence. And when consciousness returned, the sun was high, and the woods were filled with the songs of birds. The body lay near the open window where the beast had dropped it, frightened by the flash and explosion of the rifle. Her clothing was in disarray, her long hair a tangle, her limbs arranged in an awkward sprawl. A fresh pool of blood had formed by her badly mangled throat. The ribbon with which he had bound her wrist was broken. Her hands were tightly clenched. And between her teeth, was a fragment of the animal's ear. Later that same day, Murlock boarded the window. These mountains guard their secrets well. In time, these traces will vanish just as completely as the people who left them. Thank you.